So this is one of those questions which, when it's set, kind of surprises me. It surprises me because it changes the history quite so much. And when I say quite so much, I mean it basically changes the locus that everyone's arguing around from, to the extent of theoretical, to an actual practical. In that suddenly you will have a focus for the Anglo-German naval race. You will have a focus for a lot of issues which come up in that period. But there's also a goodly possibility you don't have that focus come up, because it's rather an interesting point of contention. You see, historically, Helgoland, and I've put both spellings up there because Helgoland is what it's probably pretty much called now, but at certain points it has been referred to as Heligoland, and as a fortress Helgoland or Heligoland. Heligoland just sounded cool to me, so I just went with that one. What happens if Britain never gives it up? Well, it's incredibly useful. Strategically, it literally sits off the Elbe River, and it sits off where the Kiel Canal comes out. It's a good position to both be offensive against Germany from, and to restrict their access to the sea, but also it's a good position to defend their access to the sea. And that's realistically the point where this comes in. Now, I don't know if this video is going to be a particularly long video. I have to admit, as a recorded video, I doubt it will be that long. But it's an interesting one to explore still because of the impact this could have had on history. You see, if, for example, during the Franco-Prussian War, the Royal Navy had chosen to get involved, maybe in a more aggressively neutral way, not actively fighting, but in an aggressively neutral way, then from that position they could have shielded quite a lot of problems from happening in Germany. Rather like the poodle who was just telling off next door's cat for having the temerity to look at his garden. Just atrocious of him. The Royal Navy, operating strongly out of Helgoland, could have prevented the French achieving anything at sea, and they didn't achieve much in the Franco-Prussian War at sea. In fact, pretty much they managed to prove that their navy was as bad as people suspected it was. It had been underinvested, underfunded, and undersustained as badly as they presumed. So yeah, Helgoland is useful. Also, as said, there's the Kiel Canal, there is the Elbe River. These are vital instruments of navigation. These are vital instruments of German financial independence and German financial security, especially in this period. But the thing is, outside of wartime, that's not really going to matter because the British aren't going to be interdicting trade in peacetime. Now, it does mean that in any war scenario, in any war-fighting scenario, Germany has a nightmare to deal with. And it's a nightmare which is going to cause issues for both sides, but it's more going to be a problem for the Germans than the British. Now, if we consider the history of it before we get into the full details, and this is one of the reasons why I do love alternate histories, because I get to talk about a lot of different history that impacts on things. I think it's worthwhile considering the Treaty of Kiel and the Treaty of Paris, and the Treaty of Heligoland, Zanzibar, and why they happened, and why they were pertinent. Why the treaty which gave Britain the islands, and confirmed Britain the islands from Denmark, took place, and why the treaty from the British to the Germans took place. And before I get into the Treaty of Kiel, I think it's worthwhile mentioning I have ordered a zapper. One of those things you stick up on the wall that zaps flies when they get close, because there is one in here that keeps testing me. And whilst I will get it, I'm certain, I feel that more might come and try it, and I just feel like delegating the duty of killing them all to something else, rather than me having to try and jump over a field of boxes behind these shelves to get at them. They have an unfair advantage, they fly over the boxes. So the Treaty of Kiel is about ending. Well, to be honest, it's about ending the Scandinavian portion of the Wars of the Sixth Coalition. It's about ending the battles that have been going on, the gunboat wars especially, between Britain and Sweden on one side and Denmark and Norway on the other side. And Denmark and Norway had been part of the Franco Alliance, and as such, they had to concede a few things. One, they gave Norway to Sweden, which then led to its own special circumstances and a course of events, which we're not going to get into today. In return, they got Swedish Pomerania, which they then didn't get because of those special circumstances, but Swedish Pomerania ended up going to the Prussians. Always fun. But as a result, that was also when Norway lost Greenland and all its other dependencies, which went to Denmark. But Denmark also signed over to Britain Helgoland, and it handed it over literally and specifically so that Britain could protect Scandinavia and Germany, the great Germanic territories in Scandinavia, from Franco influence and Franco oppression, i.e. the French. Specifically why it's signed over. Basically, it means, the idea is, okay, so you can have a base here, which gives you a key forward base in the region, and it's sort of your Gibraltar of Northern Europe for you, and it gives you access to these things, and also gives you the ability to influence these events quite closely, which means that, frankly, it should help with defending us from French influence, and reminding us that, it's better to be friends with the British, because we're all dependent upon commerce via the sea for our economic survival. Now, the thing is, what changes between Helgoland and for Europe between the treaties in 1814 and the treaties in 1890? Well, Germany exists. German unification takes place. That happens. That's a fairly important thing. And so now the Germans are able to defend themselves from Franco influence, and honestly, the British need to play a bit more of a peacemaker between the two anyway, because they keep having tiffs and taffs. Scandinavia isn't necessarily as important to Britain as a strategic resource as it used to be. It's still important, do not get me wrong. Saying something isn't as important as it used to be is not the same as saying it's no longer important. That's an incredibly reductive view on the universe, and it's something I have to deal with occasionally from people who are far too powerful and involved in making far too many decisions that they should listen more closely to what is being said. But the reality was that a lot of the goods which Scandinavia had principally been exporting were no longer as important to the British economy, especially not in this period, as they were in the past. Masts, for example. No longer as important in 1890, believe it or not. Steam engines and all these things had made masts less of something they're going to worry about. But what was important when they were signing this treaty was the British interest in Africa, the German interest in Africa, and in many ways Helgoland was given to Germany because it was something which Britain could afford to give without bothering it at this point, it was felt, but which Germany gaining was a massive boon for them. So it was not a loss for the British, as far as I considered, but a great gain for the Germans, which meant elsewhere in the world, they gave up quite a bit. They did get some access to the sea and various other points, which was all very nice of the British to do, but the British managed to get a situation which allowed them pretty much to surround everyone. And that's always advantageous. So basically, Helgoland was given up for not much loss, as far as the British were concerned. But then the problem becomes, and the difference becomes, is What would make the British stop that and not do that? And that's the question we now have to consider. We also have to consider that the very first naval battle of World War One takes place off Heligoland. The Battle of Heligoland, Bight. Taking place on the 28th of August 1914. It's pretty much a cruiser-destroyer battle where the Harwich Force ambushes some German patrol vessels. Now, often people list the fact that there is BT's command and some other vessels available in support, and they are, but they don't take part in the battle. So whilst they're listed as, oh, on this strength, the Royal Navy had these ships here and these ships here, they don't actually take part in the battle. They're sitting off. They're there in case German High Seas Fleet comes out, or more likely if the first scouting group comes out and tries to give chase. This was the point of them. They were there, sitting there, going, you going to cause trouble? No, no one came out. And it's exactly the sort of operation which the British really like to do in the early start of the war, because they can use their small forces, their light forces, which they've built up, and they've built their fairly big variants of the light forces as well. And they have a battle where pretty much it's 8 light cruisers and 33 destroyers versus 6 light cruisers, 19 torpedo boats, and 12 minesweepers. Yes, there are some submarines there as well, but the British lose a light cruiser and 3 destroyers damaged. That's it. Damaged, not sunk. 35 killed, 55 wounded. In contrast, the Germans have 712 killed, 149 wounded, 336 captured, 3 light cruisers sunk, a torpedo boat sunk, 3 further light cruisers damaged, 3 further torpedo boats sunk. They also lose one of their senior officers, Liebrecht Maas, who was actually a fairly decent officer. Now, if you want to be surprised about this operation, please don't be. The commanders were Turret and Keyes. So we're talking Reginald Turret and Roger Keyes. They were the ones who conceived it, they're the ones who persuaded the government to do it, and they're the ones who then executed it. The Harwich Force lived up to its name early on and carried on throughout the war. As I've said repeatedly about the Battle of Jutland, if the Harwich Force hadn't been paused and had continued on up, then at the point of the second German battle turn away from the enemy, they would have run into the Harwich Force. Now, yes, the High Seas Fleet as it's drawn probably should be able to beat the Harwich Force. Will it be able to beat the Harwich Force quick enough to manage to get away before the Grand Fleet comes thundering through at it, having heard the signals from the Harwich Force about what's going on? No. It would turn the Battle of Jutland into some sort of grand melee action at just the point the Germans really want to get away because they've taken a battering. Yes, the British have lost ships, but the German ships have got lots in a severe state. It's not a good scenario. The British ships are overall... they've lost ships, but their overall rest of their ships are mostly in a better condition. The Battle of Heligoland and Bight is exactly like that. The Germans get caught out of position, get caught on carrying out their regular patrol, and this happens to all sides during World War One and World War Two. World War Two is a good example, which involves the British basically running into a whole load of torpedo boats, which they haven't been expecting to be there. In this case, the Germans had done these sweeps several times since the war began. And this time, they ran into British light forces. And those forces were prepared to do whatever they needed to do. As is traditional for the Royal Navy. And why is this important? Because, well, the first Battle of World War I takes place at Heligoland because the British are pushing up as close as they can to Germany, and the Germans are trying to defend that area. And Heligoland is one of the areas they can secure to defend it. Now let's think about that scenario then if the British had control of Heligoland. If the British had control there, you could guarantee British destroyer flotillas would be operating out of it. Destroyer flotillas, submarines. The Harwich Force would not probably be the Harwich Force, it would be the Helgoland Force. Now that is an incredibly, incredibly scary prospect if you're Germany, because suddenly a whole lot of plans of yours for laying mines to defend your coastline go away. And if they've got fortifications built in, then to support them, let's say large, well, the Germans themselves would put 17-inch guns there that would hide away. So, the British could put 15, 18-inch guns there quite happily to defend it. That's going to mean if you want to take it, you're going to have to turn up heavy. You're going to have to turn up very, very heavy. Now, what's the scenario where Britain does fortify the islands? Where France had kept pushing. If the Franco-Prussian War and various other conflicts had actually forced the British to respond, then the British would have mobilised and armed Helgoland. And if they've done that, if they've invested in fortifying Helgoland, and they have commitments there and all these things, then you're going to get a far greater reluctance on them to give it up, even to the Germans. It's suddenly going to have value. It's going to be of use. And also, let's be honest, if you've already got it fortified, etc., and you're just maintaining and upgrading existing fortifications, you're not building anything new, then for those looking at the romping, stomping, growing German Empire with a slightly jaundiced eye going, what are you? Are you tomorrow? Are you today's friend, tomorrow's enemy? What's going on here? What are you doing? Well, it's going to be incredibly attractive because, we're just keeping its defences up to date. We're just keeping its defences relevant. We're not adding anything new. We're just keeping it up to date. We can't allow these things to fall into disarray. Remember what the French did last time? You can hear the lines now they'd come out of. And the point is, it's large enough, it's viable enough for it. It's not the greatest place in the world, it's not going to be necessarily the easiest to resupply. But there again, if you've got it and you've got enough firepower there, you've pretty much secured your protection of it. Because for the Germans to besiege it, they have to encircle it. And to encircle it, they pretty much have to get out from Kiel and get out from the Kiel Canal and the Elbe, in which case they're running straight into its guns. More importantly, if they do try and encircle it, they have other problems, because the British will not probably respond nicely. You've got enough mines, enough guns in place, and torpedo boats, maybe even submarines as well, and you could turn Helgoland into one of those spots which, frankly, no one in their right mind would try and invade. Kind of like Gibraltar most way through World War II. We can, in theory, invade. In practice, no one wants to. The same with Malta. In theory, we can. In practice, no, that's just going to be a good way to lose a lot of troops. A lot of troops and a lot of ships. This is not a sensible option for us, and is not something we wish to pursue. So basically, my suggestion is Britain would have kept hold of Helgoland if it had invested in it. And if we consider the treaties and values of it, this is going to be interesting and actually intriguing. With that in mind, let's go to a Shameless book plug. Now, of course, these are all about me promoting my books, pretty much, but there is going to be a sort of slight change of routine coming up soon, in that, of course, the Christmas books are coming up, and the Christmas videos and discussions of Christmas books, and that's going to be some brew ships soon, and things like Andrew Boyd's Arms for Russia is probably going to be in there. It's a very, very good book, and it's something which I highly recommend from this year. And there's a few others which I have sitting next to me, which I highly recommend. I'm currently trying to persuade myself that I do not need to buy a book about Mitsumasa Yonai, which is roughly £75, and is written entirely in Japanese. Admittedly, my Google Translate will help me read through it, much as it has done with this book. which is entirely about Japanese naval doctrine and their basic equivalent of Mahan. It's a really, really good read. But again, it's not one I can really recommend for a Christmas book for you all to get, because if you do not speak Japanese, and I could be holding it upside down. I don't think I am. Probably am, actually. Going by the numbers on the back, on the barcode at the back. Yes, I'm going, which I recognise. I'm holding upside down. Sorry. But yeah, it is worth a read. It's definitely an interesting one, and it's, of course, you read it, and this is always a weird thing. You read it from this side across. So instead of left to right, you read it right to left. And sort of downwards. But it's worth a read. It is really worth a read and really interesting. And I have really enjoyed it and found it very, very useful. It's explained to me a lot about some of the Japanese decisions made. And because once you... How do I put this? The thing about the early theorists is they're not always the theory which is followed, but they often set the undertones of the language and the reference points used to discuss the theories. And there's both an advantage and a disadvantage of that. It's an advantage in that you can usually find a source of the lexicon, the source of the language, and the source of the references, and so you can, if you're reading the history forward, if you're reading able to read documents forward, you can get at it more. It can become more accessible. The problem is you have to find out what that core starting document was. And if I give you an example, let's say my theories and the stuff I work with on conventional deterrence. Let's say they become the basis over the next several hundred years of how we deter conflicts in space. Well, that would be a great thing if people can discover my videos, go and watch them, and can understand what I'm saying, because they still speak a close enough version of English that they can follow it, or it's translated well enough, and if they can find my books and read them all. But if you can't, that means you're now discussing things, and you've got a context of things completely removed away from the foundation that they're based on. And that can give you a very poor image, because the foundation will include some assumptions. And they might never need to be enunciated again, because they're such an understood assumption, they are part of everyone's knowledge, so therefore they do not need to be stated. So when you're reading a book, when you're reading a text, it's already full of assumptions that you will know certain things. So good and give an example. For example, when I'm talking about this book, I discussed a lot about radar controls and radar systems and all the various management systems they put in place to organize them. I got a number of comments back from people going, "You didn't need to do this today. I already knew this from this book. I knew this from this book." And that's great. You knew it from that book, so that's fine. You didn't need to read it in my book. But there are people who've never read that before. And I was not assuming that my authors came to... as an author, I was not assuming that my readers came to this at any point with any knowledge. Maybe I was presuming they had knowledge of World War II actually happening. But that was pretty much what I was requiring them to have knowledge of. I was explaining everything else. There's even a whole section in there on Admiral Henderson. And sections on Philip Vian and other key characters. There is a whole section discussing them. Stanley Goodall has a section in there. And again, the number of people said to me, "Oh, why did you bother doing that? There's whole books about it. There's a book on Stanley Goodall. There's only a book you could go and read." Yes, you can go and read that. But the thing is, if you're reading my book, you might not have read that. And if now you've read my book, you'll now have a reference. You'll now both have my assessment of him and in the bibliography you'll have a recommendations, because the bibliography is also full of books I used to go and look at. So that's what I was very much stressing my book as. But the point is, with books like that, they are very useful books to write and read. That's why I did it the way I did. But if they do become a basis for things like, let's say, your doctrine on deterrence or doctrine on ship construction, and then they're lost, because they acted as a work which brought so much together, whilst the people who are still doing it will probably understand, because these things have always been the way they've done it, anyone trying to analyse from the outside is going to be going, or from too far enough in the future, is going to be going, this doesn't make sense. We're missing stuff. It's like, again, when we're talking about building guns or building ships or anything like that. The amount of stuff which isn't written down. The amount of stuff which is not written down. Which is passed on. So you might have the instruction manual. You might have the full equipment. But you do not have that institutional memory still alive. That's been lost. And holding on to institutional memory, that requires a lot of creative thinking in how we preserve that for things. Again, it could be books, it could be audio-visual recording of it, but also these things still have to be maintained if you want them to exist. Anyway, thank you to everyone who's bought the book, basically, and thank you to everyone who keeps buying books, and there are going to be some Christmas recommendations coming up. Thank you. So let's consider the strategic situation, shall we? Well, as I already alluded to, the strategic situation is mixed, because economically there's only really a problem with it from the German perspective in wartime. In wartime, it shuts down your economy, but let's be honest, that's not too different to any time in wartime if they're against the British. If they're not against the British, then they're fine. In fact, if they're not against the British, then that arguably makes their life easy, because the British can go, well, we're doing shipping to our own internal territories, and we are a neutral power, so you shall ignore it. And if that shipping happens to just happen to have a whole load of German goods on it, well, that's no matter for anyone to worry about, is it? Again, Franco-Prussian War, etc. If the British were kept shipping goods to Helgoland, which then had to be picked up by German ships from there, it wouldn't exactly be a difficult route for the Germans to secure. So, there are half a dozen one, six of the other scenario from an economic perspective. From the political perspective, well, that's a slightly different matter. You see, politically, it's a big thing. Getting it back is massive. The Treaty of Helgoland Zanzibar is literally that. And it's considered a massive coup. Because you're uniting Germany, uniting all the German territories, it's felt to extent. Even though you're getting something which was technically Danish. It was Danish, but there again, this is going to sound terrible, but if you read some of the German texts in this period, and some of them, the difference between what is considered Danish territory and German territory, or even what is Norwegian or Swedish and German territory, is that it's occupied by foreign governments. In that they feel that the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians should be part of the greater German Volk. Should be part of that. These are some sources. I have to admit, it's not all of them. They're not even the majority of sources, but they are there. They are there. And the trouble is, usually, my rule for things are, if you have someone writing today, publishing it on Twitter, on a blog, they are able to publish it themselves, completely themselves, and no one else needs to be involved. So basically, the only person who needs to hold that opinion is one person. If you are writing it in a newspaper or a pamphlet in the 1890s, 1880s, then that requires slightly more people, but not a lot of people. It requires usually a rich funder, but let's be honest, finding someone who's got money, but is not exactly smart, is not always the most difficult task in this world. It's kind of the legendary thing. The first generation builds the wealth, the second generation maintains the wealth, and the third generation thrills it away. It's usually quite easy to find a third generation somewhere who's prepared to fund something. But leaving that to one side, I really should have done better in trying to do that, but it's never been my way. Leaving all that to one side, stop being rude to the cat, or rather stop responding to the cat's aggression. because the cat is trying to come into your territory, I realise, but you are a large and powerful dog. You do not need to respond to it. You do not need to rise to the bait. But leaving that all to one side, in this period, if you have books published on the subject, now that requires a lot more money, that requires a lot more investment and a lot more time. And it's kind of like, again, in books today, you need to persuade several people of your argument to get this published. Now, you don't necessarily need to persuade them of the legitimacy of your argument, but the viability of your argument to attract enough interest from people that they will buy your book. It's a slightly different standard, but it's still a standard to be held to. And with those present, well, yeah. So this is a case of Denmark has given this to Britain. Britain has now gave it to Germany. For Germany, it was great because it made up for a lot of the losses the regime had suffered that year. Specifically, Kaiser Wilhelm deciding that he didn't need Bismarck anymore. Now, I have to admit, Bismarck is not at his height of his powers at this point. But I would say he is not past his sell-by date. He might not be the man he once was, but he's still better than all the other options. And we're going to be discussing the other options in a bit. And I am going to challenge you to see if you knew any of their names before we get there. Any of them. You know, I might not even tell you how many chances there are between 1890 and World War One. Of Germany, and see if you know how many there are. And in fact, start thinking about that now. Start thinking, how many chances are there between 1890 and World War One? Think about it. Militarily, it's going to be a problem. But it's high cliffs. It will be a problem. Both Kiel and Elba can be sealed up from it. It's 46 kilometers, that's 29 miles from Germany, but it has high cliffs. Very high cliffs. Look at that picture. That's not a place I want to try and take. Or let me rephrase that. I either take that by rush, or I am not taking that, because, especially as it's held by Britain, if I try and lay siege to it, I'm going to be dealing with the largest navy in the world at a time in its infrastructure and operational backyard. That's not a good position for me. It's one thing when it's stretched out the other side of the world and it's at the end of its logistics string, but when it's literally in its infrastructure-wise backyard, that's not a good position. So I need to take it quickly, or I'm not going to take it at all. So from a defensive perspective, it becomes very easy. Because all I need to do, from a defensive perspective, is be able to hold off any attackers for long enough for the rest of the fleet to arrive, and to make sure that I cannot be quickly overwhelmed by bombardment. Which means I need to be able to shoot back, but also means I need probably to bury a lot of things underground. So again, if this place had to be fortified, and as I said, the only reason I can see the British holding onto it is if they have fortified it, if they have been dealing with the repelling French issues from there, well, it's going to be kind of like Gibraltar. It's going to have to be a lot underground. That's a suitable place for it. It really is a suitable place for it. And then let's consider how the British would actually secure it, because that's worthwhile considering. As said, it's a case of not against siege, but against rush. Although you will want to have large supplies of food, etc. in there, you don't have to expect it to be an ongoing siege, unless you let someone somehow get on the dune and dominate it and start using that as an artillery position to bombard you constantly. But honestly, you're not going to do that. That's where the airfield is today. You can secure that with enough heavy artillery on Helgoland, and no one's getting onto Dune. You have... I would personally not bother fortifying pretty much anything in the lower town. You probably will do, because that's where your population is, etc., and where, the harbour is and these things. But it only needs to be minimal fortifications. All your artillery, everything is going to be upper town. You need to make sure no one can take down in any rush. Because if they're trapped in lower town, you can just shred them to pieces. Or take their surrender after the Royal Navy, the fleet turns up. I would say, if we go back to this earlier picture, and the reason I brought up torpedo boats is because they come around at this period, and this, again, is worthwhile considering. It's going to be a base of torpedo boats. It's going to be a base for destroyers. It's going to be a base for submarines. It's not a base for large ships. It's not big enough, really, to be a base for large ships. They might have facilities for them to pull alongside and quickly refuel, but that's about it. They're not going to do anything like that, and that's a coal store for most of this period. This is going to be a base for destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines. And aircraft. When aircraft come into service, the Royal Naval Air Service is going to be there like a shot. Again, it's going to be pretty darn useful for air defence of the United Kingdom, because, let's be honest, if you want to take out the airships, where better to take the airships out from? Yes, over the German coast, not over the English or Scottish coasts. Far easier to do it there, and yeah, if you can operate from that, if you can maintain it and sustain it, you can do it. It's a concentrated area, though. It really is. So don't expect to be sticking much there, but some heavy guns, heavy artillery, more than likely. We're talking, as I said, 15-inch, 18-inch guns, somewhere in that region. We're talking other weapons, sort of 6-inch, 4-inch guns, probably. And it's going to be provisioned. Pretty much anything the British stick there is going to be a good idea, because anything there is going to help hold that for longer and keep the Germans busy. Because again, if we go back to this, right the way back to the beginning, you're talking about holding the Germans in this area of their coastline, pretty much. If you have enough firepower there. Yes, they'll be able to leak ground, but getting a battle cruiser out, getting a significant force out of there is going to be difficult without them being spotted. And if you've got a nice undersea telegraph line going straight from there to the UK, well, then you've got another advantage, haven't you? Because you can have those transmissions going off and no one can tell it's going on. And yes, you can go, well, the Germans, what about them going and cutting that cable? They could do. But they have to get there to cut it, which means they have to know where it goes into the sea. There has to be only one cable, and goodness knows me, the Royal Navy has no ships which can lay a cable in this period, do they? They have no large ships which can lay cable in this period that they can possibly use to lay multiple cables. And to work out where a cable goes, you need to roughly know where it comes out of the water, where it goes into the water, and where it comes out of the water. Now, you could say, well, they could just trawl the bed nearby to cut the cables, and they could, but that's not exactly the best beds around there to trawl, and it gets fairly deep fairly quickly. Not a good idea, in other words. But then we have to think about, well, what did Wilhelm do? Wilhelm, of course, places a big store in getting this back. He's a contradiction in so many ways. He is a special child. And I want to emphasize this, he is a special child. There is a long list of people who would have made a better Kaiser for Germany in this period than Wilhelm. Not least of all his own brother. But Wilhelm is who we have. Wilhelm is egotistical and vain. He believes himself to be the smartest person in every room. He both wants to be the most British person you can ever be, and then is upset because he can never be out-British the British because they're the British. And he really does want to out-British the British. He has a humongous chip on his shoulder where it comes when it's concerned to the British royal family. But at the same time, dearly wants to be accepted into them. He wants to be recognised as both that he both loves and wants to be recognised as their most preeminent member, but also despises them because they don't. And it never occurs to him that perhaps because he's a bit of an shit, and I'm spelling it because I try and keep it as polite on this channel for my little cousin's sake, but I'm just spelling it out, to his mum, that for some reason her brother might not like him for being it. And he can never seem to understand what the problem is with his uncle. Goes, why is he not, treat me with respect and glory the way I deserve when I call him these names, and treat his sister, my mother, the way I do. I don't understand why he doesn't consider me this great person. I'm sorry. The world comes around. Now, the thing is, if the British have Helgoland, then I'm sorry, he's going to fixate on it. He is going to absolutely fixate on it. In any war scenario, he's going to demand to reclaim it. He's going to bring it up at every treaty opportunity. In fact, in the Helgoland-Zanzibar Treaty, there is a story that the British left it off the table, knowing he'd bring it up, and knowing they could demand concessions to bring it onto the table because they knew how much he would want it. Now, there's the trouble is with these treaties and these things is a lot is never written down. A lot of the side conversations, the conversations which happen outside the room in the cafes and the discussion points and in various meetings, never gets written down. So we don't really know above some very tangential sources what might have happened in that treaty. But considering how involved he was in the treaty, considering how focused he was on certain parts of the treaty, it would not surprise me. Because, let's be honest, the British government have spent a lot of time for many centuries by this point maintaining a professional diplomatic service whose entire focus pretty much is on reading people. Now, there's nothing particularly underhand about this, or particularly wrong with this. This is diplomacy. This is to use the phraseology at the time, I'm not sure what phraseology they use today, the British civil service British diplomatic service trying to find points of agreement. That is, points that they agree on, and that the Emperor will agree on, so that they can get an agreement that suits their needs. And remember, the British priority was to get points in Africa, get spaces in Zanzibar, etc. at this point. And that's what they did. They achieved that. So that it makes sense. It makes sense to go for these points of agreement. Now, for Wilhelm, though, that means this is a weakness. It means it's going to be a focal point. It means in any war scenario, the British government, the Royal Navy especially, think about Jellicoe, think about Fisher, think about all the mines involved. Think about all of them. Mountbatten, or as he's known at the time, Battenberg. They're all going to know that about him. They're going to know this about Wilhelm. They're going to know what his weak spots are, and they're going to plunder it mercilessly. Because that's what you do in wartime. So this is going to niggle at him. This is going to be something he's going to keep focusing on, keep thinking about, keep bringing up at conferences, keep bringing up in discussions. He is going to obsess over. There's Tirpitz. Now, Tirpitz always makes the case for a navy from the perspective of challenging the British. But in this perspective, and, having their same chances of a place in the sun, achieving their status, for being able to be powerful enough the world cannot tell them what to do, they can tell the world what to do. All sounds so attractive, doesn't it, when put like that? And the reality is, this would give him a big problem with all of that, because it's suddenly going to become a fixed point of German strategic focus for the Navy. In fact, it's going to be very difficult for the Navy to focus on anything else other than the Battle of Helgoland. The battle they know must come in any war with Britain, the Battle of Helgoland, to secure Helgoland. And they will have to figure it out. How do they do it? Do they develop amphibious ships? Do they use a big battery of battleships to secure it? Do they use flotilla defense to cut it off from the outside world with cheap, easy vessels that you can afford to put in place in their hundreds? What do you do? And there's a problem for him. If that becomes your strategic focus, then everything else he's trying to put through won't happen. The good argument that comes out is, are battle cruisers necessary in that scenario? No. You're thinking about fighting a battle not far off your shore. You don't need battle cruisers to tell you the enemy's coming. You're going to know the enemy's coming. The enemy's going to come. So, frankly, battle cruisers don't help. And you can go, well, battle cruiser allows to reach a... Considering the distance you're talking about, there's no chance you're going to reach there first. It doesn't matter if you're taking a 21-knot ship or an 18-knot ship. The actual question becomes, do you need to have fast battleships for this scenario? Do you need to have 21-knot ships, battleships, or can you afford to leave them at 18 knots and put in extra armor? Do you turn your battleships into some sort of unsinkable beast that can just take a pounding and keep pounding back? It's justifying a high seas fleet versus a littoral fleet in this period is going to be his trouble. Especially in the face of the Wilhelm, who's going to be obsessed with Helgoland. But there again, he's always trying to hate the British, so it should be okay. So, yeah, this is going to present an interesting thing. And I haven't included Holzendorf in this, because frankly, he goes nuts with Tirpitz as is on the traditional historical scenario. And the actual what actually happened. Under this scenario, he would be probably sitting there having standing rows with both Tirpitz and Wilhelm. So he might be alive. He might end up having an accident. But before we go to the next slide, remember I asked you, how many chances do you think there was between the fall of Bismarck, who pretty much is the first and only Chancellor for many, many years, and World War One? How many chances do you think there is? And do any of you remember who they are? Any of you? Any names come to mind? Just think about that now. Okay? This next slide will reveal all these answers. About these mostly political non-entities. The chancellors were Leo von Caprivi, Chlodwig zu Schillingfürst, Hohenlohe Schillingfürst, sorry, Bernhard von Bülow, and Theobald von Bethmann-Howlig. Now, he managed to last 1909 to 1917. So he did roughly 8 years. And Bernhard von Müller did October 1900 to July 1909. So he did roughly, let's be honest, roughly nearly 9 years. Nearly. Very close to 9 years. Very, very close to 9 years. Oh, it's very close. And then Chlodwig Hohenlohe, get it right in a second, Schillingfürst, did October 1894 to October 1900, so he did 6 years. And Leo von Caprivi did March 1890 to October 1894. So he did 4 years. I would say they get, broadly speaking, better, but if you consider the top one on that side is Leo, and then it goes Chlodwig, and then it goes Bernard, and then Theobald. Hello. Yes, hello. yeah, they try their best at various points. But the trouble is, once you've got rid of a minister, once you got rid of someone as powerful as Bismarck, you kind of get a heady idea that you are really the bee's knees. After all, you got rid of the most powerful man in your country. The man who, let's be honest, is kind of like Charles Dance's Lannister character in Game of Thrones, who can order the king to go to bed. He's that powerful. He's powerful enough, he's in charge. Well, not the king, not the Kaiser. And that was always going to cause trouble with someone like Kaiser Wilhelm. What's really funny, of course, about Bismarck is that the previous Kaiser he didn't like because he was reforming, but never tried to would never have tried to treat him like that. He created Kaiser Wilhelm. He gave him all the attention, all the stuff he needed to try and, get him as a counterbalance to the Kaiser, the reforming Kaiser, and then he ends up with him, and Kaiser Wilhelm gets rid of him. Because turns out the puppet thinks he's the master. It's never good. And yeah, the world deals with the world reaps the whirlwind of the local politics. It's always fun. But anyway, these four ministers each have their own backgrounds, have their own interests and their own views on diplomacy, on foreign policy, on what they are going to achieve. I'm not saying that Helgoland, still being British, is going to dominate their careers, but it's going to create an ongoing problem for them, and it's going to make a problem even for the army. And actually, the one thing it does cause an interesting result with is with the Navy and the Army, is that Navy suddenly has something which they say, we need these resources for the battle for Helgoland, to reclaim Helgoland, and suddenly that becomes a political fight which the Army possibly can't win. So it's going to create a problem for the politicians who are trying to run the country, because they're going to be trapped in an endless cycle of battles and political matches between their navy and their army, between the Kaiserlich Marine and the Wehr. Here, and that's going to be something which is going to be dominating German politics for much of this period. I'm not saying it's good to have the recipe of creating a Japan-style scenario, because we're dealing with a very different culture and very different peoples with a very different worldview. For starters, they're not an island nation. Japan is an island nation, therefore they're used to looking internally. Germany is a very much interconnected part of the world. Let's be honest, for many, many years they were the place which empires divided up amongst themselves, not their own country. And this means that there are things which can happen in Japanese culture and could evolve in Japanese culture, which would be very different in how they would evolve in German culture. Hello. Do you just want up in on my lap, is that it? Or do you want to really, really lick my seat? Sorry. Decided he wants attention. If he's not able to deal with the cat outside, he wants attention. Poodles. Come on, so much love. Oh, again. Oh, you. Small creature. Small creature. Oh, ow. So. Saying of the four chances, though, I think most likely the one who would come to feel most regret about it is going to be Holweg, if he's still the Chancellor. Because again, the point that could be made on this is that without the early win, Caprivi, who was really definitely nowhere near as capable as Bismarck was, might have fallen earlier. And if he falls earlier, there is another option instead of showing first. A couple of actually other options who might rice power, and that could change all this flow. So all those people who we are used to seeing could be different. But personally, looking at their generations, unless it changes remarkably, I do not see anyone really replacing Bullo or Holtvig in actually getting the roles. Because, frankly, there's just not enough people. There's not enough people. Are you watching yourself on the screen? You are a strange bloody coffee beast. Truly are. So, what kind of fleet do the Germans build? Because this is going to be the big thing that's going to be affected. It's going to be the fleet that they build. As tempted as I was also earlier to discuss, they could go for a fleet which is even more battleship oriented and battle orientated. Cut out the battle cruisers, and the battleships could be more heavily armored. They could have more guns, and they could sacrifice speed for that. That could be how they work it through. They could happily go, well, we don't need to do 21 knots, we can do 18 knots. We need to carry more guns and more armor, so we are more survivable in the fight, and we're able to do more of a fight. It will change things. It might also make the Anglo-German naval race have a very different edge. Because for the British, it's going to be their maneuverability and tactical deployability to get to Helgoland for the battle, but they have to make sure they arrive there with enough force to overwhelm the German fleet and smash it. And once they do, then with the control of Helgoland, they can control the German North Sea coast and pillage Germany should they wish, or break off Germany's contact with the world, etc. For the British, the battlecruisers might get a job of going through the Öresund. Instead of them being part of the Grand Fleet and fighting in that scenario, they might be sent off to instead, you will go round through the Öresund into the Baltic while the Grand Fleet is fighting the High Seas Fleet over the Helgoland, and cause them to have to be split to divide their forces because you're suddenly blasting away at German defences in the Baltic. There are all sorts of options because this is going to trap everyone. Everyone's going to be trapped into fighting this battle. You could say, well, what about the option of not fighting the battle? Well, if you don't fight a battle, your fleet's trapped inside the North Sea, and it can only go out through the Öresund, through Denmark. Now, I have to say also it could make life a little bit more dangerous for Denmark, in that suddenly, with access to the sea so limited, then for the Germans, control of Denmark becomes control of a route into the Atlantic, control of ports, things which can't be influenced by the British. But to be honest, I don't think trying to take over Denmark is a good idea for the Germans. There are few countries which have as strong a sense of self as Denmark. I can see it being a very, very bad scenario to try and go in there and go, we're going to take you over and make you part of Germany. I don't think that's going to be something which they're going to achieve without a massive ongoing occupation. And the thing is, it wouldn't take much effort from other powers to turn into an absolute quagmire for Germany. It could even break the nascent Germany. So that's a realistic option, that one. Now, as you can guess, this is a different day. This is because I really didn't like that section. I didn't like it at the end. I felt it didn't cover things enough. And then go into some of the ships that could be built by the navies involved and what could be the case. So, I have a fresh bottle of Iron Brew. I have a fresh t-shirt. Well, I should do. It's a couple of days later. And, I thought I'd give it another shot. You see, the problem here in this scenario is if you have Helgoland, as I've talked about at many points, is the battle becomes almost predictable. You know pretty much where you're going to have a fight. Because Germany can't not. As I've discussed many times, they can't not engage. If they choose not to engage, they might as well choose not to have a fleet above what they need for the Baltic. In fact, you could argue in this scenario that the very construction of a fleet, like they did historically, can only be viewed as an attempt to retake Helgoland. And therefore, the British are going to inevitably invest even more in Helgoland and building up its defences, but also it becomes a focus for the Royal Navy fleet and their structures. And with submarines and torpedo boats and destroyers operating out of Helgoland, you have a problem. And probably something laying mines as well, a mine layer as well. You know, with big enough guns, etc., you suddenly have a break there. Something the Germans have to take. So the point becomes, you're almost building battleships as siege engines at this point. And that's really interested me to think about. Because the German way of building their navy, etc., they in many ways ape the Royal Navy, but on building it almost in miniature. And I've said before, this doesn't really work. This doesn't work for Germany. They end up with ships which don't really fit their strategic needs. I discussed this a lot in the concept of their battle cruisers. Well, in this scenario, they will need completely different battleships from those which the Royal Navy's got. The Royal Navy needs battleships it can send around the world to fight anyone, anywhere around the world. True. And they're still going to need that, even in this scenario. But the Germans need battleships that can turn up, take on the might of the Royal Navy, take on the defences of Helgoland, and beat them. Because if they can't get past Helgoland, they can't get past anything. So what does that lead us to? Well, to my mind, it leads us to less worrying about the speed of the battleships. Honestly, going for turbines, going anything, you don't need it. An 18-knot ship will do. Frankly, an 18-knot triple expansion engine will be fine. What you do need is something which is going to have very thick armour, a lot of subdivision, and a lot of firepower. You're going to need it to be able to fight. And the reason it doesn't need the speed is because it's not going to be running away. But it is going to be involved in pretty much a siege operation. It is pretty much going to be waiting there for the Royal Navy's fleet to come steaming over the horizon. At which point, they're going to have to make sure they can sell themselves as dearly as possible. Because again, the Royal Navy is always going to outbuild Germany. They're always going to build more. So you need to have ships which are going to cost the Royal Navy ships to build. Or worse, are going to force the Royal Navy to either adapt their own construction to build something which is suitable for engaging your ships, but not necessarily suitable for their needs around the world. That's if the Germans would actually think through that, because again, if you consider in this scenario Tirpitz is still likely to rise up, still the ranks, and still likely to come, but Tirpitz doesn't strike me as the type who's going to do that. Honestly, we look at Tirpitz construction, Tirpitz always is dreaming of ship construction, of building ships, but he doesn't dream up new types of ships. He doesn't push the boundaries of ship construction. He doesn't push the edges of ship development. In which case, the Germans end up in a worse strategic situation with a fleet which suits it even less than it did historically. And that's worrying for Germany, because this is one of those scenarios where the Battle of Helgoland and Bight, it takes place in August like it did historically. But what happens is that battle is going to be the Battle of Helgoland and Bight, the Battle of Jutland, and the Battle of, I don't know, Falkland Islands, all thrown into one, pretty much. It's going to be a battle of annihilation between the fleets. And a battle of annihilation, which is basically a battle of attrition, when you've got the advantages the Royal Navy's going to have there, stacks up. Because yes, The Germans will probably have their torpedo boats there as well. Yes. They'll probably have their U-boats there, like the British will have their submarines. Yes. U-boats or submarines. You know, they're all the same. They will have them there in limited numbers, like they both have in 1914. But still, the thing is, if this battle's taking place in gunnery range of Helgoland, you're going to have all those guns backing you up, mines, and all those other systems. And for the Germans, they're going to lose ships first in pushing towards the island. They're going to have to, because if they're not losing ships heading towards the island, there's no reason for the Royal Navy to come out and fight them. As long as the Royal Navy can still reinforce Helgoland whenever they want, they don't need to come and engage. You don't need to send the Grand Fleet there to sit there and wait for the Germans to turn up. No. In fact, the Royal Navy wouldn't. I can still see the concept of distant blockade coming up in terms of where the fleet's stationed, made especially possible and especially tight thanks to the close blockade of the inshore squadron based on Helgoland. It won't be the Harwich force, it'll be the Heligoland force, as said. And that's where you start to have problems for the Germans. I've discussed the idea of taking Denmark, but I don't think that's a really good idea for Germany to do, and it's a good way for them to lose a lot of resources and support and end up with a lot of problems. Also, it's a good way for them to end up even more broken up post-World War I, when they inevitably lose. Realistically, in a World War I time frame, World War I technology, Helgoland is going to be something, yes, you can, given enough time, reduce to a smouldering wreck. You can force all the British forces on the island into bunkers. Agreed. Deep underground, whilst you're turning the surface of the island into a charred wreck. The trouble is, the time it's going to take you to do that is far more time than it's going to take for the Grand Fleet to fuel up, steam up, get their steam up, and head towards you, and get to you. Especially with a conventional built fleet. With a historically built fleet. You know, in this scenario, battle cruisers really don't make sense for the Germans, because they've now got to get past they're not just going to provide reconnaissance and second line battleships for fighting in the North Sea. They're going to have to get past Helgoland first. And shells go faster than ships do. Now, yes, there will be some shipping lanes which will be just about outside the range of Helgoland's guns. But realistically, those are also going to be spaces which are going to be well within range of things like coastal motorboats. And let's be honest, the Royal Navy will be absolutely happy to exchange dozens of coastal motorboats to get a single battlecruiser. When I say happy, it's more a case of, we don't want to lose any personnel's lives, and they never want to do that. But, yeah, if I exchange 24 coastal motorboats, those little small motorboats, to take out one of your battlecruisers, that is a trade I will make any day of the week. Because it benefits me. I can replace those motorboats within a couple of days. You can't replace that battlecruiser in a couple of years. So therefore, this creates some problem for all of this. This creates a real problem for all this. In that the fleets that we built, for the British, as said, they still need to build around the world fleet. But again, if they've taken on siege ships with thick armour, if the Germans have got really thick armour, the easiest way for the British to accommodate that while still building ships around the world is to do the gun jumps more quickly. The Germans are building dreadnoughts which have far thicker armour and slower than the British Only answer to that question the British have is to upgrade their guns. Possibly have to work on shell design as well for check their penetrative capability against the thickness of armour. Who knows, Jellicoe might win those arguments over shell design early on. And I don't see how that makes anything better for the Germans. Because if the Royal Navy are forced to jump a class earlier to 13.5, maybe a couple of classes earlier overall, so there's only 2 classes of 13.5-inch gunships to 15-inch. Because they have to keep jumping. By World War I, are they on 16.5-inch gunships? Or are they on 18-inch ships? The reality for the Royal Navy is going to be, we need to do what we need to do around the world. So we want to build a balanced dreadnought design and a balanced battlecruiser design as much as we can, you know, within our needs. If we've got to also deal with the fact that we've got this primary threat, which is a primary antagonist who are building basically siege battleships that are based on thick armor and lots of guns, but not necessarily as fast, then we want something which has the maximum penetrative power we can give it at the maximum range we can give it, so we can control the range of engagement and can dictate it to these ships. It adds a dimension, certainly as the Germans go the outreach to the Anglo-German naval race, but it also adds a dimension to the global techno race. It makes Germany, in a way, a participant in the global technology race and the dreadnought tech race, because now it's their armour thickness which the British will be racing against. And how subdivided their designs are. But the sad thing is, as sensible as I can see that policy being under this scenario, I still can't see the German Navy doing it. Because of Tirpitz. Tirpitz has many interesting qualities and many valuable qualities, frankly, as an admiral. He is very good at politics. He's very good at putting forward the case of the Navy. He's very good at pushing for the things the Navy needs. I cannot disagree with any of that. But I also cannot claim he's good at it. In terms of strategy, in terms of procurement. He really isn't. Because pretty much what he's doing is looking at the Royal Navy and going, I want a German version of that. And that's not good. That doesn't do him any good. That doesn't do him any service. That doesn't do his fleet any service. And I can't see anyone else taking... This is what I'm saying. Holzendorf tries his level best to get rid of Tirpitz. He doesn't succeed. Pre-World War I. Because Tirpitz is too good at the politics game, but also Tirpitz is too loved by the Kaiser. And I don't see the Kaiser being any different, because he's probably still going to be born slightly with some issue with his issues with his body. And he's probably still going to have the relationship with his parents where he doesn't like them. He's probably still going to get exploited by Bismarck. And he's probably going to turn out just as neurotic, just as narcissistic, and just as so much of a sod as he historically was. I just don't see that changing. And whilst, no, I am not a psychological doctor and I'm using that terminology, my PhD's in war studies. I'm a naval historian. I've taught psychological warfare. I've spent enough time around the analysis to know what I'm looking at. And he's got the classic traits for all of those things, and a few more. Mostly because he spends his entire life being surrounded by yes men who want to get their places by stroking his ego. It's the same thing you saw with Elvis Presley and a few other things, where the people around them are not good people. And they feed the worst parts of his personality to get what they want out of him. And in this scenario, that makes it even worse.
Because he might believe things like it will work. He might believe things like, yes, the fleet can take that. And in this scenario, I could actually see him leading the fleet that goes out to try and take Helgoland. I almost said take back there, and they never had it. Go and take Helgoland. I could see him, the Kaiser, wanting to lead that fleet himself. Which adds a whole nother issue to that battle. Because if the Kaiser gets killed in that battle, what does that do to the war? Possibly ends it. Does give everyone a nice, neat thing to blame it on him. He's died. We'd like to make this war over now. Bad juju and all that sort of thing. Sorry. We all apologise. Blame it all on the leader. Let's go back to our corners. That could be an interesting thing. And also at that period, if you haven't really lost that many land battles, you just want to lost a major battle at sea, that could actually work. That could actually lead to peace. You got a tiny window before December 1914. You've got a tiny window where something like that could actually work. But it's going to depend. As my suspicion is they build a fleet just like they always did. Which means World War I in this scenario would be incredibly different. Because if the battles are all about Helgoland, or rather the first big battle is all about Helgoland, and it's over, and my suspicion is that it would be a Royal Navy victory, but not a victory without loss and sacrifice. That would be my suspicion. And I base that on probably sheer quantity and the geography of the situation that's going to be around them. And the fact that if the Helgoland force is anything like the Harwich force, they will be taking names. They will be taking names and sinking ships. And frankly, if they're what they initially have to go through, that's already going to put the Germans at a disadvantage when it comes to face. If they've lost major ships to the submarines and destroyers and coastal torpedo boats of the force before they even engage with the ground fleet, then they're at a disadvantage. If they are a ground fleet in an aping of the ground fleet again, a ground fleet in sort of proportion, then they are definitely not going to have the chance. And so, as I said, I could see a World War I in a scenario where the ground fleet's dreadnought battleships go to Helgoland and have a massive fight. And I could see the battle cruisers pushing through Öresund into the Baltic. And I could see the Germans falling apart and World War I ending pretty much in this period. Or rather, when I say falling apart, I could say once the fleet's been annihilated in detail, the Germans will be very, very afraid. What will the British do? Will they land troops? What will they do in the Baltic area? And again, if they've got Helgoland and they've got the fleet there and they've blocked it all up, then Germany's supplies from the outside world goes down to zero. They can't get the supplies through the Baltic. They can't get the supplies anywhere. World War I could end a lot quicker in this period. And that will have impact on the world. A great deal of impact. It could also conceivably go on for longer because the Germans could not attack Helgoland as soon as they could. They could just sit in harbour and leave it alone, waiting for the opportune time. But the trouble is, the opportune time is probably never going to come. And the anti-submarine... The scenario then becomes far worse for the Germans in many regards because for them to get their U-boats out to other bases to operate them from, they would have to go past Helgoland and its hydrophones. They would have to travel through that area where I can imagine the Royal Navy would be very happily operating the Royal Naval Air Service from. I can imagine a lot of fighters appearing there and a lot of anti-submarine aircraft, because that would be an absolutely amazing forward base to run it off. To intercept Zeppelin raids before they even get over the North Sea, to intercept submarines before they've got out into the North Sea. It's an absolutely great place for that to base those from. So this is the problem that Germans are going to have to face. This is one of the reasons why I think it's inevitable that it's actually in August they attack. But that won't go in their favour. It can't do. Because for it to go in their favour, they have to perform not just better than they did historically at Jutland, they have to perform amazingly. They're not going to get that lucky. They're just not. So World War I in this scenario could be a lot shorter. It could be a lot shorter. And that then leads to other issues, because if World War I is over by December 1914, then A, there's going to be people who believe modern war can be over quickly. B, there's probably going to never be the same issues with the Ottoman Empire, although I don't think it's long for this world on those scenarios. C, there's no League of Nations. D, there's no American involvement in the war. And the change is going to be, in terms of the international relations makeup, is going to be pretty big, because whilst you lose Germany, in many ways, because I can guarantee any version of peace in this scenario is going to have something along the lines of the naval provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. But in this scenario, you might not have the punitive and other stuff the Treaty of Versailles imposed, because frankly, there's no need for it or justification for it. So it might be a case of Germany doesn't have the maritime industry anymore, isn't able to have that, but it is able to have other things. Whatever the French are happy to give them, but the French won't be quite as murderous as they were post-World War I as historically. The Americans don't get involved though, and so lots of things won't come out of this. Which is going to be an issue for the next 20 to 30 years, but, you know, it'd be interesting to see how it would work out. So, yeah. This is the other thing I was sort of thinking about in a Helgoland scenario. You see, I could see in a Helgoland scenario the British going for triple turrets earlier on. And I could see the Royal Navy, when they're ordering the 5th turret for HMS Dreadnought, it being a triple turret they ordered rather than another twin. Which would give them 11 guns rather than 10. And would give them a 9-gun broadside. I could also see them, because traditionally she has those guns because of the Lord Nelsons. Princess Blight's 4 of them. 2 other Lord Nelsons which Fisher was apparently planning on building. That's how he got the cover for getting them. But, you know, the 5th turret is always the extra turret, and that's always the one where he could have gone for a triple turret or something else. But the other option, of course, is you have triple turrets down the centre line. So you have 9 guns on the centre. And you have the 2 twin wings turrets. Which would give, of course, you, as here, 7 forward firing. But would instead give you 11 broadside. It could work. Realistically, the reason I say that is because, again, it comes down to punching through that armour. If I'm trying to punch through that armour, having triples over twins makes a lot of sense, because my problem isn't going to necessarily be just accuracy. It's got to be punching through that armour at range. And the more shells I can chuck at you, with the information I have available, the more likely I am to actually hit something. And if I hit something, the more likely I am to penetrate it. If I hit it a second time in roughly the same, in a similar area, that will possibly kill it. Because as I said before, the first time is what resists the armor, not that the armor resists for the first time. No guarantees the second time you hit. So, yeah. That becomes the issue. So, I always finish these videos with a question. And honestly, Helgoland gives me many, many questions, but the point I'd like you to think about is, I'd like you to think about the coastal motorboats of the Royal Navy and the Kaiserlich Marine, and their equivalents. And I'd like you to think how they would develop in this scenario, because I could see those boats getting a lot of funding. I could see those boats becoming centerline of pretty much everything. And that could be really, really intriguing. It could also be quite fun. But I'd like to hear what you think about them. And that's Working for Bookshelves. Thank you to everyone who's been doing super chats and super thanks about. Normally, as said, my money basically goes on the books, which help me keep the channel going, and the research trips. At the moment, most of the money is going towards IKEA stuff for the Calyxes to take all the heavy books, and some legs coming for them to help them be higher. And again, I have reasons for this. And I explain this, and some people take offense to me talking about my dogs, but I'm always honest about everything. You know, whether I have trouble in what I'm doing, and whether I have trouble as being an academic, or I have trouble with other things, I explain them. And I explain the scenario is, the reason I like the feet is because it works better with dog ownership, because I like having dogs. They are good for security, they're good for family happiness, and most importantly, they're good for company when I'm working long hours on my own. Although, speaking that, I'm currently working at 1:30 in the morning, and my dog, instead of keeping me company, is off sleeping in someone else's, in another one of the bedrooms further along in the house. Definitely he's got the right idea. Warm bed versus sitting on the floor with me talking. He's sensible. He's a good fluff. But yeah, so I'm thinking I'm going to need at least another 2 4x2s. And 10 of those feet. Those sets. 5 white, 5 black. And that's probably going to be it for a while. Because then I've maxed out what I can reasonably put in this space until I've managed to get rid of the boxes and the stuff in here that are from my family stuff. And that's not going to happen until there's been an extension. So hopefully I can do that more at a sensible pace and function into everything else I'm doing, rather than I need to get these all now. And I've just moved house, and I am cash flowing so much here I can't afford to do that, and thank you very much for your support. Because that's what happened. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible to set up the office at all at this place. I'd still be working out of books. About boxes. The books would be coming out of boxes. And that's all thanks to you. Thanks to you that I'm set up like this. Thanks to you that I'm able to work so easily, work as relatively easily as I am. And thanks to you, the books are being looked after properly. So thank you. Because you made it possible. And for those who wonder why these are useful for having, if you have a dog and raising up, it's because A, I have a corgi who puts out a lot of fur. B, when you have puppies, they pee places. They're still learning how to control their bladder and they wander around. And like all young animals and quite a lot of old animals, they have trouble with bladder. You deal with it. It's fact of life. It doesn't mean you don't love them and don't like to have them there. It's just something you have to deal with. And so having the bookcases raised up a bit makes it all a lot easier to keep clean. There's also potentially that I treat myself at some point, because I don't know, I win a lottery or something and I get myself one of those lovely little robotic hoovers. And have that going around to help keep the fluff under control and the fluff cleared up, because that would be sensible. That would be sensible for me. Why do I say it'd be sensible for me? Principally because I hate trying to hoover beneath desks and things, and the Robo Hoovers do that quite well. I don't think anyone really likes having to hoover beneath desks, but I do know some people who don't mind it. Me, I always seem to bash my head when I'm doing it properly, because I go in there to try and make sure the nozzle gets into all the places it needs to go, and end up bashing my head. I'm a klutz in some ways, I really am. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you very much for your support, it all makes it possible, and I wouldn't know where I'd be without you, all frankly. Take care and hope to see you soon. When this comes out, it'll come out on a Saturday, so Brew Ships will be tomorrow night. There'll also be the Twitch stream as normal on the Sunday morning. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed what I've been doing so far. Coming up, we have got Never Built Carriers on Tuesday. And next week, hopefully advertised very soon, and the week after that, hopefully advertised very soon, because it's been recorded, is going to be two historians to Royal Navy that could have been with Drakenfell. Him and me chatting for nearly 3 hours. Nearly 3 hours is recorded. I'm still not sure, and this is going to be the next question, and it's going to be a real test of people who've watched the end or not, so I'll be able to tell from the answer to this. Do I post it all as one solid video, which is nearly 3 hours long, or do I break it up into two videos? What do you think for me and Drakenfell talking about the aircraft carriers that could have been for the Royal Navy? Be really interested to hear what you say. Take care, and thank you very much again for all your support. Thank you for making it possible. Ba-da-da-da.